Well, hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Critical Weight Theory. And I guess this is a sort of odd topic for Friday the 13th, because I'm not talking about a Friday the 13th movie or, a spooky topic or anything like that. In fact, even though this is a political episode, I'm not going to be talking about the emerging war between Israel and Iran. No, instead, I'm going to talk about what you've probably also heard in the headlines that factories are coming back to the US. But here's the kicker: where are those people to staff them? So, today we're doing a bit of a reality check. Reshoring isn't the silver bullet. We're seemingly running out of workers, and that's a crisis unfolding in plain sight. And, there's always some workers who will have a struggle finding work. So, reshoring, bringing manufacturing back from overseas, has sort of become political theater. You hear about battery plants in Michigan. Well, I just looked at an article about that, and they spent about $1 billion on it, but created 200 jobs. So, 200 doesn't sound like a lot of jobs to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's, you can fit 200 people into a small room. Maybe it's an old article. I don't know, but I just saw that in a quick internet search. And you also hear about semiconductor thingamabobs in Arizona. Yet the people, they're not lining up, at least not as much as you might think they would. A Fortune snapshot from April 2025 reveals it. Enthusiasm in theory, low application rates in practice. The workforce is shrinking fast, not from laziness or narrow tastes. It's more structural than that. So the numbers don't lie. Since 2007, from what I understand, we added nearly 18 million people, but fewer hands are showing up for work. The labor force participation rate, or the LFPR, is stuck well below its early 2000s high of 67.3%. Today, from what I understand, it hovers around 62%, driven down by retiring boomers and automation. So, if you have any updated figures or if it just sounds plain wrong, you can go ahead and let me know about that. But that's what I have gathered as information here. So, recession era disruptions hit hard. Automation replaced factory jobs, and globalization offshored countless positions. Meanwhile, service sector roles, low wage, part time, dominate. And as I've often used as an example, the industry of the movie rental place no longer exists. That's just an example of the type of job that has pretty much vanished. And, we might make fun of movie rental places as being outdated and just silly compared to, the streaming alternative. But the point here is that it's an entire industry that's basically vanished for the most part. And there are other jobs that are going to follow in a similar direction, pretty much going the way of the dodo bird. So, how do we deal with that? Well, in fact, a Wells Fargo report warns up to half of the 3.8 million projected manufacturing jobs by 2033 may stay empty due to labor shortages and skill mismatches. So the rural workforce is hollowing out. Over half of US counties lost population between 2010 and 2020, and non-metro regions now see more deaths than births, unable to offset with migration. And what hasn't worked? The declining birth rates, and I hate to sound like I'm JD Vance or something, but it actually does factor into this. U.S. fertility sits at about 1.6 children per woman. Replacement is 2.1, and you know it's dragging this trend forward, and women are delaying childbirth. Education is rising, and rural populations shrink faster. So attempts to revive birth rates, baby bonuses, pronatalist messaging rarely move the needle, and they come across as being creepy. So nations like Sweden still struggle despite heavy investments and tariffs. They may nudge some firms to friend shore, but they cannot rebuild a workforce out of thin air. Mexico and Vietnam are soaking up jobs instead. Immigration offers the most realistic remedy, oddly enough. Migrants tend to have higher fertility and help stabilize rural labor markets. But current US policy chills that channel because, there are bigots who are in charge of that. So, ironically, one of the solutions is to actually increase migration. Um, but unfilled jobs aren't just economic blips, they disrupt communities. Schools lose mentors, local businesses lose patrons, hospitals cut maternity wards and close doors. For workers, shortages drive up hours, ignite burnout, and raise stress without raising real wages. Companies unable to attract labor, automate, or offshore anyway. This plays right into corporate hands. Cheap, exploitable tech replacing human beings. And, as I often do, I'm going to look at the story from the sort of anarchic lens here. This is class warfare disguised as economic evolution. Institutions from schools to healthcare collapse under neglect while bosses shift costs onto individuals and machines. So let's look at the roots and remedies. What's driving the spiral? There's demographic decline, fewer births, delayed childbirth, and rural depopulation. Aging populations also figure into it. Like I said, boomers are exiting the workforce or just dying off. Elders are, rising in rural areas. The number of elderly people. The policy failure is also there. Child policies are superficial. Immigration is restricted. Labor rights have been eroded in many ways. And it's all about economic extraction. Capital chases cheap labor abroad or automates shrinking stable domestic jobs. So the sort of anarchic approach demands radical solutions. Empower worker cooperatives, break big pharma and big tech monopolies, fund comprehensive child care and health care, abolish wage theft, and dismantle restrictive immigration systems. You know, it's like gun control of capital, that is worker ownership, and it's as urgent as any other sort of defense. This is something people really ought to be working on right now. So, what comes next? Reshoring won't matter unless we ship out the status quo. Paternalistic employer schemes, wage stagnation, and isolation of rural working classes is a real phenomenon. What's needed now is national health care, child care, housing as public utilities, education that trains for trades with dignity and not just college, open, welcoming migration that rebuilds communities, worker run factories and farms with democratic pay structures, defunding wars and redirecting public wealth to social infrastructure. So that's not a fantasy. That's how ecosystems recover and build resilience from the bottom up. These are things people could do. So if this unsettled you, good. The first step is recognizing we have a crisis, not just a labor shortage, but a breakdown in social solidarity. So I'm Wade, in case you didn't get that, and this has been my reality check. So subscribe, share, and radicalize your reality. And see you soon. I'll be, you know, addressing more of these forces driving these uh, things that we read about in the news.